So our next panel is celebrating successes in strategizing struggles. We have Leila Brammer, Graham Bullock, Sara Drury, and Tim Shaffer on deck. And so if you're ready, Leila, we'll kick it off with you.
Thanks. And thanks, Kevin and everyone else for being in this space. It's been really nice to have a space to be together in. And hopefully one day we'll be in 3D world together as well. I am going to have to time myself. So thank you for that, Martine, and reminding me up front. I have also reframed my remarks based on what I have heard earlier today. I'm also in an interesting space because I was on a email chain, which I'm often on, about free expression because the Chronicle had a piece about it. And I always just want to respond to it. It's discourse dummies. And so let me walk through that. My original presentation was going to focus on a set of questions that we should be asking ourselves. And there's a set of questions I asked myself when I came to the University of Chicago. That question is, what is the goal? What is the goal that I want to achieve? And Kevin started us off this morning with this idea of the equipment for living, right? The rhetorical sensibilities, the capacities for engaging. And then Pam brought us to that idea also to tie it into the enhancement of democracy, right? That's what we're doing. And then I'm always got to have a question about how do we reach that goal? And is what we're doing actually reaching that goal in ways that we could really measure it and center it? And how many students are we meeting with reaching that goal? And then, of course, there's some questions about, is what we're doing what we want to do? Is becoming institutionalized, requiring some degree of compromises? Right? And then is there a sense of a sustainability about this, particularly in thinking about resources? When I came to the University of Chicago, I came without a department behind me, right? So it's a very different way of constructing something. And with the mission to embed it and to embed it in a kind of parallel process with the principles of free expression, what that required of me is really thinking about those principles and the ways in which they've been appropriated and talked about and limited. We often talk about academic free expression only as something that individuals do, right? It's an individual liberty. Sure, it is. Not going to disagree with that, but that's not why we have it. We have academic free expression because it is something that we do together, right? We have it because institutions, academic institutions, are pursuing knowledge. And the way to pursue knowledge is that we have to come together and disagree. And indeed, what we have to do is have a communal value in which we all have some capacity to seek and engage difference and disagreements, right? And two, understand that that discursive space, even at an academic institution, is not level. So how are we ensuring that when we're seeking and engaging disagreements and differences, that we're hearing a multiplicity of perspectives? For me, both of those are discursive issues. They're discursive problems. And I come from a discipline that both has theory and practice to deal with that. And so we've often thrown a bunch of things at it that are tactics and modes and means at it, and forgotten to come at it as a theoretical issue that involves discourse, and that we can build practices and build capacities, and that we need to embed them across not just the curriculum, but across campus if we want to change that culture, if we really want to do this thing where we're engaging people. I also came to the University of Chicago with the idea that I could not recreate a model that was going to be unsustainable for me as an individual, right? So I so admire the work that Sara has done and Pam has done and others, Katie and Martine. That's phenomenal. And I admire it from afar, and I'd love to be involved in it, but it wasn't just, there wasn't space to do it at the University of Chicago. I knew that if I chose that path, I would end up doing it alone. And so how did I build something that actually got embedded? So rather than thinking about how to institutionalize a program or a tactic or a mode or a means, I changed to thinking about how do I institutionalize discourse? And then how do I talk about it in ways that when I go out on outreach, that I can crystallize it quickly and provide people an approach that allows them to see their own discourse and discourse of others in a new light, and perhaps enter into that discourse in ways that could be more helpful to support democracy. I said this in other forums, and you can question me about that, but if we're going to depend on facilitators to do our democratic discourse, and I love facilitation training, and I love what they do in the world, we're not going to get it done, right? So how do we get it so that citizens, that Dewey idea of democracy, are able to think about their own practices as they're talking across fences and at bus stops? And so I've crystallized a process for thinking about that. I also want to note that I also entered with some fear and skepticism about things. You know, we have this notion at institutions about certain things, right? We bring students in and we teach them how to write because we think they don't know how to write, right? We would never bring somebody to an academic institution and put them in rocket science and then say, go build a rocket, right? Because it would go off the rails. And yet we do that with discourse, this thing that is so central to the institution, right? Academic freedom, free expression. And we bring them to campus like, well, they know how to do that. And it's sort of like, I'm blessed, I'm looking out over Lake Michigan and it's icy today. It's sort of like throwing them in the middle of the lake and we haven't taught them how to swim. So how do we build capacity for that and really embed it in a curriculum? I also want to, Deandra said something that was really, I think, insightful about her discipline, but I think insightful about academics in general, is we also are doing some of the things that cause the most harm in a discursive environment. We are reifying old practices of a previous century that failed us then. And so I really want us to think about the ways in which we maybe fail when we're reifying either or concepts, right? If we're going to enter into a discourse and it's an either or proposition, I promise you, it will end up in division. It will end up in us being entrenched. It will end up in actually furthering that divide. Second, we enter students in a position of advocacy. Why? Why are they advocates when they don't necessarily understand? And I think that's true about citizens as well. Is the question, should the minimum wage be $15? That seems to me an either or type of proposition, and one that enters people in at advocacy, as opposed to entering people in where they actually, I don't know, I don't have enough information to tell you what the minimum wage should be, right? What if we entered people in at a different point? And the question is, what's the nature of a living wage? That is a discussion that everyone can enter into. It is one that doesn't put you on the political divide, right? I think our third problem is that in doing so, we also reify the political divide. I don't accept it. I accept that we have discursive practices that have resulted in it, but I don't accept it as a given because there are discursive practices that we can implement that disrupt it. So rather than taking it as a given and deciding that we're going to bridge the divide and have discourse around that, and then reify it by saying you have to be blue or red, what about we disrupt that and enter in with a different type of question about what is the nature of a democracy that supports us all? Or as Martine, I loved his grid, right? It gets us from those value propositions in that small left-hand corner to really thinking about what are the values that we might share. What is the thing that we can come together about? What are the things that we value that are important to that process? And finally, I know what you're thinking, and I've rushed through a lot of different types of things. So what do I suggest? Well, I go to a process of discourse that's deeply rooted in Aristotelian. Oh, is he here? Yeah, well, surprise, Pam. I keep him so close to me. Here he is. In the rhetoric, people think it's a book about persuasion. It's not, and you can read it that way. It's a book about a discursive practice that starts with the first thing, which is understanding. He says you can't talk about something unless you understand it fully. And so discursive practices, if we really want to build something that's going to be useful, is we start with people at understanding. We move them through a second process, which is dialectic, right? Rhetoric is the handmaiden, the counterpart of dialectic. How do we test ideas together now that we understand different perspectives, multiple ones, not either or? How do we test those ideas together? 3, to the third point, a collaborative. You know, he lived in a deliberative democracy, that he was working through this in a collaborative environment. And then the final thing we actually do is advocate. We fail with what we implement. We fail as a society and a democracy when we enter into those conversations at a point of advocacy, rather than entering them in at a point of understanding. And so when I looked at the things that people were doing that were working, so Katie and Martine and Carolyn, you're getting communities back to understanding, right? What is the nature of the thing that we are talking about? Getting them back to understanding. When I think about the deliberative process, particularly the Kettering model, I think what it does best is disrupt the either or and get people to being able to see that there are multiple ways in which we might view something. And then I think, what are the other types of ways that we can embed and build that in classroom discussion, in residential halls, in a campus quad environment that really build capacity for students to engage in and actually seek out multiple perspectives, hold a space for the multiplicity, and build a capacity for students to ensure that that multiplicity is as level as possible. So those are the questions I am dealing with. I have to tell you, when I spend a lot more time building out that process, when I give it to citizens and give it to even high school students, they're able to all of a sudden diagnose what they're doing. They're able to realize that there's a different way of entering in. That alone provides a foundation on which we can build other types of ways of involving people and building out democracy. So challenges and successes, sure, at a principles level. So I will leave it to the rest of you.
Thank you, Leila. That was terrific, and many challenges for us all to think about. Graham, you're up next.
Okay, great to see you all. And you just all disappeared from my screen when when I turned that on. But so I'm flying blind. I can't see you guys, but oh, there's Mike up there in this window. Okay, so hey, Mike. So good to see you all, and it's wonderful. I know many of you, but not all, and it's just a fantastic opportunity. I've learned so much already just this morning, and look forward to learning more. So let's see. Am I sharing? You guys see this screen? So there's did it just change?
Yes.
Okay, so new screen setup here. So what I wanted to do today with you is talk a little bit about the Deliberative Citizenship Initiative here at Davidson, and sort of following Kevin's instructions, talk about five successes, 5 struggles, and then 5 sort of recent innovations that we're working on kind of currently. And then a couple sort of maybe pieces of advice that might be useful. So, but first is just introduction. So the Deliberative Citizenship Initiative, or DCI for short, is a cross-campus curricular, co-curricular, and community-oriented program. We launched in January 2020 with a training program, facilitator training program, and with a lot of partnerships with the Dean of Students Office. Our Dean of Students is one of our co-conveners. Our Director of the Center for Civic Engagement is also a co-convener. The Director of our writing program, who's here with us today, Van, was also one of our founding co-conveners. And then we try to partner with a lot of other organizations as well, student organizations, departments, organizations in the community, the Davidson College Presbyterian Church, Davidson Learns, North Mecklenburg Economic Mobility Collaborative. So trying to, from the beginning be as collaborative as we could in sort of our mission of creating spaces for Davidson students, faculty, staff, alumni, community members to engage with one another on sort of difficult and challenging topics facing our society and our community. And some specific goals of teaching deliberative skills and creating a sense of meaningful community and reinforcing humane instincts, researching the deliberative process itself, and then also engaging with catalyzing policy innovations. And so in terms of successes so far, and just to note, on that January 2020 start, so we were starting off, and then just 3 months later, a small little pandemic occurred, and that slowed us down a little bit, but we got some funding from the Duke Endowment and later from the Associated Colleges of the South, and we've decided to kind of go for it, and despite and even because of all the challenges, because of the pandemic, because of the election, because of all the racial tensions that were happening in that moment. And so some successes over this last almost 2 years now include the following. So at the core of the DCI is a fellows program. We've got each year 10 to 13 fellows. It includes students and faculty, staff, and community members who learn how to facilitate. We do trainings for them, and then they engage with the deliberative, sort of theory and practice that is in the literature and is out there. And they're very active. They meet weekly, and they develop their own personal deliberative projects. And they lean into what I have as dispositions, deliberative dispositions. We talk a lot about humane instincts and human values as a foundation to this work, and a real focus on facilitation. So every week we talk about the work they've been doing in facilitating. They also help with our original content generation, number 2 on the list. So we love NIF guides, we love living room conversations, etc. But we got a lot of feedback, kind of little pushback initially from our participants. They didn't like either. They were sort of too hot, too cold, a little too much information or not enough, and then some other critiques. So we decided to build our own deliberation guides. And so we've been working hard on that, trying to making them very salient and picking topics that ripe, as Martine talks about. And that's been a lot of work, but I think pretty successful so far. And we're always innovating. It allows us to improve on the model when we adapt others that we don't have that flexibility. Also, we do deliberative forums once or twice a semester that we've developed this model. It's kind of like deliberative polling, but different. So we have an expert panel with diverse perspectives, scholars and experts on that panel to first present and then deliberate among themselves, setting up breakout rooms where the audience then deliberates among themselves, and they've sort of warmed up, they've seen a panel talk, and then they can engage with each other, and that's been really successful. We have over 100 people at each of our forums so far that have had that model, and we're trying to continue using it. D teams. So this is, I think an innovation in this space. So these are small groups of 5 to 10 people who get together regularly, sort of like iteratively. We've had different models 3 or 5 times over the course of the semester, where they talk about different topics among themselves, and they're led by a facilitator, and they have those deliberation guides to guide them, and then they can sort of re-sign up at the end of the semester for a new team. And that's been a way to sort of try to build a little bit of trust, and for people to be able to talk, like speak their actual feelings and opinions about issues, and it's been going pretty well. And then a final thing is we've had a lot of success in terms of multi-generational diversity by involving both students and community members, and increasingly alums. We've had a lot of Davidson alums participate in our activities, and so they've loved being able to talk to students, and students talking to people across the sort of generational divides. So those are some successes, some struggles that maybe resonate with some of you. viewpoint diversity. So definitely leans liberal and Democrat, and it's hard to get conservatives to come. We've had some progress in this with having more alums come and older participants. They have a kind of wider range, but still it's an issue. And so we've worked hard, a lot of innovative ideas about how to encourage people to come from across the ideological spectrum. And then also, challenges with racial and ethnic and economic diversity. Again, I think we've improved, on that, but we can always do better in terms of having that sort of plurality of voices and perspectives represented. Zoom has helped a lot with this. Almost all of our stuff has been on Zoom, and that enables a wider diversity of people to show up. They don't just have to live in Davidson or be within driving range. Another challenge, we've leaned in a lot into sort of intellectual humility and being open and curious, and that's been, I think, a success, but maybe to a fault, and then we're trying now to focus more on intellectual courage and actually, saying things that people might not agree with, and but that you feel strongly about. And then also deliberative rigor, right? Like challenging one another and pushing the boundaries, like, well, I didn't really understand that, and doing it in a civil and respectful way, but not just asking, taking things for as given, but to actually have an exchange. And then making, I think one of you mentioned this as well, trying to connect with policy more, sort of having a little more stakes in the game, that it's not just talk, it's not just the sort of first stream exploration, but there may be some consequence to the conversation. And so we're working on that a little bit. So quickly, sort of recent innovations, we're trying to this semester do single topic D teams. Well, they'll focus on one topic, like abortion or guns or college admission policies. Those are our topics for this semester, so easy topics. And they'll be able to dive deeply into those topics over the whole semester. And we're also trying to sort of engage the campus more with a semester launch party and DCI lunches, where fellows host like things in commons, where it's more informal deliberation, and still trying to have conversation agreements and following, sort of deliberative dispositions, but trying to sort of open it up a little more. It's not this very formal thing. You can come and just join and have a good conversation. We'll see how that works. We're also launching a DCI membership program just to sort of try to build more community around the DCI. You sign up on the website, you get access to like our deliberation guides and pathway guides, which are guides we give out after each deliberation on what you can do next after the conversation. And then we're doing more on curricular innovation. So we have a deliberative pedagogy deep collaborative, about 15 faculty, 9 from Davidson and 6 from Associated College of the South schools. And they're all right now like embedding deliberation in their spring courses after working on them over the fall semester. And then this spring, I'm actually requiring my students in my 2 courses to sign up for D teams, and they'll be part of my courses, and they'll write little essays about their experience, and so trying to make that curricular connection greater. And then finally, getting outside the Davidson bubble, and I think this is a sort of query for general conversation, is that realizing, like, even if we have perfect representation from our Davidson world, right, and maybe the Duke world or the the UNC world, we're probably still going to have that viewpoint diversity problem. And so how do we break out of that? And I'd love to have conversations just within North Carolina. So Leslie and Deandra and Kevin, like, how do we break out of our little blue islands, and reach other audiences and help them reach us in a sense, right? And so and then nationally as well. So that's that. And then very quickly, I know I'm over time. I think I'm right on time. So think hard about program orientation, complementarities, and trade-offs. So I've heard a lot of this already. So like, we try to do all of this, but I'm realizing there are trade-offs, right? So are we going to talk about polarization? Are we focused on argumentation and public discourse? Or are we focused more on values? Or are we focused more on policy impact? because it depends, what you do has, you may do different things depending on what your emphasis is. So being aware of that. And then the trade-off between innovation and focus, like wanting to innovate, but also avoiding mission drift is really important, because people come to us all the time. They want us to do all these different things. And we're like, not enough people to do it all. So how do you kind of stay focused, but also take advantage of opportunities? And then planning for the short and long term, right? So that's always a trade-off, that all that institutionalization that Katie was talking about, like how do you do that, but also do the day-to-day. So have to keep, kind of eyes on both of them. So I'll stop there, but look forward to chatting more.
Awesome. Thanks, Graham. And next up is Sara.
So I too, like many of you, have enjoyed the conversation today. And as a result, I've shifted some of my reflections and remarks. And I'd also like to bring in some different ideas that might stretch our conversation both today and in the future. So I'll organize my thoughts around successes and struggles over three themes. So the first is foundations, the second is collaborations, and the final is sustainability. So in terms of foundations, I think we've heard a lot today about the foundations of this work, how it is both interdisciplinary and yet has deep disciplinary roots and contributions. And I think that's one of the opportunities and challenges of doing work in deliberative democracy, right? There's a lot of different fields that can contribute to it. And yet, as Leila was mentioning just a few minutes ago, I think that idea of how do we think critically and deeply about discourse and training our students to have better discourse in multiple areas of their lives, not just when, right, they are in a conversation in a class or on campus, but also when they go and have conversations with their friends and family around dinner tables or in living rooms, things like that. So I also think one element of this work is that we need to maintain a foundation of optimism. And I think for me, that has been an important success of the program, is taking a more positive outlook on the work that we're doing. And I think it's easy to become very pessimistic or frustrated with the world that we live in. And yet I think deliberative democracy and the work we're all doing in public discourse has the potential to provide, right, an infusion of a more optimistic component. And I don't say that as a false optimism. I'm not saying that we all need to get around a fire circle and sing some campfire songs, although I am a Girl Scout, and so that would be fine with me. But what I'm trying to say is, I think that many people are looking for not necessarily, right, everything sunny outside, but the potential for hope. And I think we need to keep that as a foundation in our work, that we believe that we can use discourse to, right, investigate and critically examine some of the deepest things that divide us, to create space for voices that have been historically excluded, and ultimately find new solutions. And I think that foundation is critical to the work that we do, because it reminds people that we can do politics in a different way. And so to me, that's a lot of the heart of what I try to bring into, whether I'm doing a community training or whether I'm teaching my classes. And I'm seeing some nods, which I appreciate. Again, I just appreciate so much the video presence of this conference today. It's been really great feeling like we are in a room together. I also think there's an important foundation in what we do as institutions of higher education. During the lunch break, several of us were having a conversation about misinformation, disinformation. And I think given the difficulties, right, in the reputation of higher education, it's important that we're careful, right, about infusing that first order deliberative goal of issue learning into our processes through multiple perspectives of engagement. And that's been talked a lot today, but I had not heard it connected explicitly to our mission as institutions of higher education. And I think we need to keep that foundation kind of frontline because it is significant to the work we do. Deliberation has tremendous potential to educate, not just about others' perspectives, but even how our values relate to some of the information that's out there. And I think this is some of the work that we do in programs of public discourse is repairing, right, the reputation of higher education as more of an advocate rather than creating a space for high quality information and argumentation. And so I think those foundations are really important to our practice. The second theme of successes and struggles is thinking creatively about collaboration. And I appreciate that we've all been sharing resources today, because I think that one of the things that we need to work on in the next decade, right, is finding ways to better disseminate some of the stronger methods of teaching practices of doing discourse, facilitation, and deliberative design. And also, right, creating opportunities to create capacity in the community. More and more, an important struggle for me is to look in the mirror and ask myself, what might it look like for my community to no longer need my students to go facilitate, right, in a conversation? And I think it's, again, in this role that many of our institutions fill, right, we are both educating our students on practices of public discourse. We might be doing collaborations with campus and community partners, but I think we always need to keep an eye towards what does it look like, right, to infuse deliberative practice into a local government system or beyond. And I think this is where I really appreciate some of the work that has been done by Martine and one of his collaborators, Leah Sprain, around cycles of deliberative inquiry. And I mentioned that, and we can hopefully put it in that document, because I think as many of our centers grow in our practice and we think about sustainability and collaboration, it's useful to think about ways that the cycles of going around, right, issues, wicked problems, and issues of public concern, we can improve the quality of discourse, but we also should be improving the capacity of the local community to respond deliberatively. And one place that I've seen that in really exciting ways is with my own local government. We're very fortunate to have a lot of community officials who are thrilled to have a more participatory public engagement. So in a lot of ways around strategic planning, they've sort of infused the practices into their work. It may not be how I would have designed it, but it is definitely authentic to the way they engage the public. However, in the wake of the summer of 2020 and the mayor creating a special commission on racial equality, they were able, right, they quickly turned back to us and said, we're not comfortable leading this one, right? And I mentioned that's not a step backward. I think the fact that they were able to say, we know we need more of an impartial facilitation for this difficult conversation to be a gain in their own deliberative understanding of the issue. And so in that sense, it was for me this aha moment in terms of thinking about how locally the way we talk about difficult public issues, right, is improving over time, even as we are facing a very difficult public problem around diversity and inclusion in our community. And so again, tempering that feeling of, oh, we're back at square one, we're having this tough conversation and people won't commit to dialogue. No, right? The very fact that we can create space for a really fraught conversation is a positive for our community. And so that really leads me to questions of sustainability and thinking about the struggles for building capacity over time and sharing resources. And I did want to mention two specific resources that have not been covered yet as a final closing remark. So one is I'm really encouraged by the work of the Interactivity Foundation in the Collaborative Discussion Project certificate. And I think if you're considering ways that deliberation may need to go beyond your public discourse center, right? I'm finding, and I've just put their link in there, I'm finding this to be a useful set of activities. It's all open source in order to allow community partners to build their own capacities. In other words, to help citizens, right, prepare themselves to enter into deliberative conversations. And so it becomes a both and. The other collaboration I've been quite excited about, again, during the lunch break, we were talking about truth decay and the Rand Corporation. And I wanted to note that the RAND Center to Advance Racial Equity Policy is promoting deliberative conversations as a key policy initiative for addressing racial equity in the United States. And I think they've just begun this project, but I'm really excited about the ways that we might think through how institutions of higher education could connect to some of these opportunities. And so these happen to be two projects that I'm quite involved in. So I'd be excited to connect with people on this call, either today or after, about some of the opportunities for collaboration and creating more sustainable centers and programs for public discourse as we work together in this goal for democracy. So thank you all.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. And finally, Tim.
All right. So, in many ways, I mean, at this point, this is where it gets a little tough, just not to say like, yeah, ditto, or kind of reflect a lot of what's been already said. But in some respects, I think some of what's going on here at K-State actually might add a little bit, some variations. So I guess I want to start here because in some ways, I think the rootedness of this work comes from another time, right? In some respects, our institute is one of the earliest, if not the earliest, I think when you talk about some of the groups that we're talking about now that came to exist in large part to respond to what was then referred to as kind of this crisis, right? Of this polarization, kind of the complexity of issues and the like. And so origins in 2004 it has continued, and some of those people in fact are still deeply involved with this work today. And I say this in part because I think there's a lot of alignment and repetition with others, because this intersects with kind of the multifaceted dimensions of what it means to be a university today. For us, we're a land grant. So we are a larger institution thinking about these kind of multiple pieces, which has always been something that has long informed this work. Importantly, a couple of years ago in 2020, we shifted from being under the provost's office under our Center for Engagement and Community Development and broken apart. And so now actually sits within our Communication Studies department, even though we still have a much kind of broader orientation to the work we do. Again, another image, slight variation of the one we saw earlier, but the things that shape and drive our work are in many respects very similar. I will say we're fairly model agnostic. So really figuring out what makes sense for the context, but really relying in many respects back kind of these streams, these frameworks that become really helpful, because what's going on, we are having community conversations this week, both on campus. And in fact, just a moment ago, got an email that we're working with our faculty senate, because they're also trying to explore some of these questions as it relates to community engagement. So I want to say all this because for us, a big part that drives a lot of this is that kind of scholarship question. And for us, the books that have, I don't know if I had to step out a little bit ago, so I might have missed a little bit of this, but for us, the larger conversation that many people on this webinar have been involved with have kind of led to some of these projects. So the examples in deliberative pedagogy, as well as in the Creating Space for Democracy book, really reflect what happens here through our institute, which are in classes, they are in communities, but they're also in places like residence halls and the libraries and the like. The third one that I highlight here is actually something that was developed last year and is now being utilized in an undergraduate course in our small group communication course as an open alternative text. We have a pretty robust model of that at the university, trying to push that direction for access. One of the strengths is we've been able to kind of deal with the fact that a lot of small group communication books don't explicitly talk about some of this. So we've really geared it towards that direction. And I will say the link at the bottom might be helpful for some folks if you want to kind of poke around a little bit. Even that language Graham was just referencing it there. But for us, a big piece of ICDD's orientation really has been primarily community focused. And as I said, as a land grant, this largely means the state of Kansas. So we have some things that are happening hyper locally, but there are a lot of things that literally kind of embrace that Wisconsin idea, right? Think of the state as the campus. And so we do a lot of work with cooperative extension and other kind of community partners. And so even for this example, for some examples from this semester, We're doing some facilitation of discussions locally here in town. Those couple images there on the top highlight what's been going on literally this week, as well as this collaboration that we're solidifying this. We have a new dean of our libraries and is really interested in creating a space. There is a Dow Center for Multicultural and Community Studies, but really having it become a hub for very, very regular, more than I'd actually kind of like, civil discourse kind of engagements. And so we're exploring this in a way that is very specific here. So it's not just kind of abstract kind of topics or general, but very geared to the things that are relevant to K-State. So agriculture is a major aspect of what shapes a lot of conversations here. So we're collaborating actually with our diversity, the Associate Dean in the College of Ag around Black farming and the implications of what it means in a place like Kansas and elsewhere. And then finally, kind of this mapping project across the state that's been going on for the last couple of years, but this gives a little bit of a flavor that we have students who are involved with this in different levels, and I'll speak to that in just a moment. What happens though, and this is where I think we might be a little bit different, we have a strong orientation actually to graduate education. So I'll start there and I'll move back to the undergrads quickly. We have a certificate program that moved to K-State a number of years ago. It was a professional development opportunity. It now exists in both ways, but largely what we have people doing it as credit. And so you can see here the introduction to theory as well as practice, but kind of a range of things under our dialogue, deliberation, and public engagement certificate. These are for graduate students across the board, but understandably, as you see, the prefix, a lot of communication that happens. But what's really this has led to is actually our new doctoral program. We're now actually reviewing our fourth cohort or fifth cohort of leadership communication. So literally every student in this program does a community engaged dissertation. At the heart of it is this idea of communication for democracy. And so as we think about this, what's happened at K-State is we've kind of taken an orientation less from the kind of bottom up, so to speak, but much more orientation to the graduate level. What does this mean? What does it look like? And I'll speak to a little bit of why that's kind of played out that way, for example. I know Martine's going to do a little bit of a repository for some of this, but we have done some writing about this. A number of colleagues here kind of explaining the development of this, of that program, that leadership communication specifically, but where it's embedded within our curriculum for kind of the dialogue deliberation work in the Institute at the undergrad and graduate levels. So what does this mean? Well, so ICD is embedded, but it's primarily, as I said, at those graduate levels. For undergrads, we've always struggled in this regard, that they experience trainings, opportunities in courses and such, but it's very specific to that open access text that I showed you, for example. And I would say episodic. And so this is some of the negative here, is that for a variety of reasons, we've really struggled with that. The institutional dynamics really play in here. I know some of the other institutions are similar to this, but I might phrase it a little bit like this, right? We have a credit model that you pay for every credit. And so it's often a pursuit of what's the most efficient path through. So we've been kind of disincentivized because of that, and also because of a kind of a structural reality of not wanting to create new things, try to embed it within what exists. And the challenge is we don't explicitly talk about this at the undergraduate level specifically. And so when we think about this, we have a pretty robust model at the graduate level, and it's been really integrated. All those conversations that I was pointing to, largely we have current students and also recent graduates of our graduate programs, master's and doctoral programs, doing a lot of that work. Some undergraduate students, but it's much more kind of interspersed rather than being as robust, say, like Colorado State or Wabash or some of these other spots. But it is a challenge. And as we think about, I think, the future, I think Sara was just noting this, the sense of what helps create some of the capacity and the opportunities and the longevity of these things is to have this kind of integrated across the whole. And for us at K-State, I think one of the positives is we figured out how to do this as it relates to those who are often mid-career and coming back and looking at the questions that are challenging and vexing. But for undergraduate students, it's still a rather episodic kind of experience. As much as we've been around for a while, it remains a real issue. And for the sake of time, I'll stop talking, and I look forward to at least a few minutes of some discussion.
Thanks, Tim, and thank you, panelists. We got some time for questions, so that's a nice surprise. Questions or comments?
Tim, I'd love to hear more about how you conduct those graduate level projects on community engaged work, how you kind of work with the timeline of graduate school, find partnerships that will be productive over that duration and are realizable and realistic.
Yeah, that's super challenging. Turns out that's kind of hard. One of my advisees, a candidate right now, who's in fact in residence at the Kettering Foundation, went through 3 projects before, or the attempts to kind of get there before one kind of stuck, and it's done super well and it's great. I'm really looking forward to what's coming. But I think it does highlight that, and it's been one of the glitches, is that we kind of came down hard and said, that's what this program is. It's this intersection of leadership and communication. We have a big collaboration. We have a center called the Kansas Leadership Center, the KLC, down in Wichita. So that's been one of the major kind of institutional partners here, but it's been tough. We are very multidisciplinary, so we have people across the board. We have the special assistant to the Dean of Agriculture here. She works and previously worked in the state level administration in agriculture. So we've got people who are working like very high levels of in industry. And we've got people very internationally now, literally across the globe. We have a lot of those in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. We are a host for YALI, the Young African Leaders Initiative, through the federal government. And so we've got this really interesting mix, but it's a real challenge, but it also presents a real opportunity because there is a longevity to it, right? It gets us away from the kind of semester long or even a couple years that, for them, it is that, but it's so focused and intense that there's a real robustness to it. But it is, I mean, you've named it exactly. The challenge is, how do you get it to work? And especially COVID has been a real dilemma in a lot of respects, is that what do you do that's not another exhaustive Zoom? And that's been a real question, but it's been something that folks have been able to navigate, which I think indicates, both the interest and the commitment on the part of those who are in the program. It's a great question.
Thanks, Tim. I have a question. A couple of you made the point, Leila, you made this point, and Sara, you did too, about changing the entry point for students rather than jump to the debate, and instead thinking about how we inform ourselves about an issue. And I'm curious how you do that while also preserving our expertise as people who study discourse and argumentation, and also caution against maybe brushing against other people's expertise. I think whether this is right or wrong, I think the model that people probably have in their minds is, well, they learn about the topics in these classes and then they learn how to debate them in your classes. And we know that it's much messier than that in reality, but I'm curious how you navigate those things.
I'll start. I think there's 2 components. So one is, I think, in classes where we are, teaching about, right, the debating, or in this case, the deliberating, right, of issues, I think it's important, right, to acknowledge that we work in collaboration, that every wicked problem brings together a variety of disciplines. And so when you start taking that perspective, it becomes less about, right, oh, you're just bringing the discourse or the strategies, and more about what are all the different fields that enter into this issue. And where I've seen a lot of success with this is infusing deliberation into the science curriculum. And I'm working right now with Pamela and Katie on a large grant that focuses on how do we, how do we do deliberation on socio-scientific issues? And it is always a question of scientists saying, but what if they get the science wrong, right? And I think it's and I use that as an example because I don't want them to get the science wrong, but I also don't want them to get the economics wrong. And I don't want them to get the cultural history of talking about contaminants in the soil in Indiana, which has huge issues of systemic inequalities, right? And so I think it's accepting that there are variety, right? Trying to create an entrance point where a variety of disciplines are contributing information and acknowledging that's part of navigating wicked problems and encouraging a better deliberative discourse is recognizing the right what we don't know and that there's a lot of areas for exploration.
Well, I would always just like to follow Sara and say ditto on things. But I would also add to that is, again, the disruption. I mean, part of it, you know, I don't know if you can see me cringe, but the word debate itself makes me cringe because of how it has become the only mode for political discourse, and then embedded in the classroom to reify that same sort of piece. Every time, and by the way, I love debate. I came from debate, but when we enter in, so I hope, I'm guessing, Kevin, you don't mean this, is when we are asked to frame questions that have a yes, no, or an either or type of response to them. We are just reifying that same thing and entering people in at that space of advocacy. I'm always going to go back and reframe a question about what is the nature of the thing we're talking about. So rather than what are we going to do about the water supply, which actually is a more open question, maybe are we going to build a new water tower? I'm always going to go back to the question of what is the nature of the water supply? What do we need from it? What are the constraints? What is the information out there? And I think also when we back off that place of entry, which looks like advocacy in political discourse, right? That's what students come to us seeing. It's also looks like that, I think, in the classroom often in class discussion, and we back off and reframe questions that are about what do we know about this and what can we collectively know about this? Let's enter into information about this. I think it also moves us away from that disinformation. No, it's still a disinformation problem, but it changes the nature of our disinformation problem if we are collecting and trying to understand something rather than collecting information to make a particular case or argument. So can we just move back and start at that square? And I think that alone has some opportunity of training capacity for students to enter into discourse, enter into problem solving, enter into their personal, professional, and civic lives with a different starting point. I also didn't say this, but you know, it is the mode of academic inquiry. We don't have them come on the first day and write a BA thesis and make a statement, right? We have them first understand the discipline that they are in, right? So I think that moving everything back to that understanding is a great academic move.
Deandra, I know you had your hand raised. If I could do a hot pursuit just because it's on this point. One thing I didn't say, and I think it's also interesting here, and what was just being mentioned, I think highlights this. At K-State, I forget who it was, Graham, I think you were talking about it. We actually exist at a center-right, pretty right institution, right, at the undergraduate level. And so it presents an interesting opportunity of, and the graduate level, it's more mixed, but definitely not left-leaning, just nature of place and focus and things like that. But I think beyond just moving, like even that language becomes pretty unhelpful pretty quickly. But I think the bigger thing is this orientation to kind of retaining what has been versus the opportunity for exploration. And what we found here, that's been one of those kind of interesting points when we think about these questions of what's successful and what's not, is how much of this in a kind of ideological perspective or psychological is I want to retain what's been versus what else might be changed. And so all that kind of category, I forgot to say it, but what was just being mentioned there, I think does align with this whole orientation to how do we even step into like naming the questions, right? Because that's a big piece. So I didn't mean to cut you there, but I left that bit out in my brevity earlier.
Thanks, Tim. Deandra, did you want to get back in there?
Yes, please. So a quick question for Graham. It was really exciting to hear about all the programs that are coming out of DCI. And I think it's such an innovative mix. And I'm really curious about, and just insofar as you can share, would love to know about what staff capacity, what kind of institutional support it takes to do this kind of programming to your mind really well. And I know you mentioned that the pandemic has shaped the way that your programs are delivered over the last year or I guess couple of years, but wondering how things might change if we ever make it out of this pandemic, and also if there might be things that you see yourselves retaining post-pandemic.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Deandra. And I'd be happy to talk offline too more, but just briefly, I mean, these are questions we're, dealing with right now, actually. We were able to get a pretty substantial grant, so $250,000 grant from the Duke Endowment, which you, I'm sure, know of, that it helped us launch this. And so that allowed us to hire a coordinator, which has been critical, and also I happened to be on leave on sabbatical and had some course releases to help get it going, and that was also critical. And so now we're sort of trying to figure out, okay, what do we need to move forward, and it's not just one person, but it's not the sort of large center that I think, like Martine and Katie have going, which is incredible. And so, trying to empower students to do more, right? So like that's been a move this year, having them take on a little more of the work, but that's really hard. I mean, like, for example, we have deliberation guides that we're trying to write for this semester. And if they don't live in North Carolina, they're legally not allowed to work over the break. So Carl and I have to do that work because they need to be ready by whatever, February 10th, and so there's, limitations on how much students can do, even not considering how much work they have in the classroom. And then there's the, others can speak to like a student-based, class-based model. Like, so our fellows are paid, they're not in a course right now. And that has definite advantages because, they're employees and you can, sort of count on them for the whole year. But, also this is probably one of the last things that they prioritize. They prioritize their courses more often. So there's trade-offs. But I'd be happy to talk more, Deandra, like, and, compare notes with what you're trying to do or thinking about at a Duke. So
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Martine.
I'm just going to throw something out really quick. I'm going to share my screen because it'll be a little bit easier. I popped this into the document as well, but some of y'all have seen this. It's also kind of still playing with it, but I started with debate. I never taught debate, but I taught debate classes. And then I was really anti-debate for a few years. And I was convinced of like, well, there's some good debate. We need good debate, not bad debate. And maybe this also kind of ties to the notion of Graham's like deliberative rigor, right? So part of what I bring a debate back in is, okay, we need processes to elevate strong arguments and expose weak arguments. Something that dialogue doesn't tend to do very well because it's so, open-minded. We want to, hear one's story. We don't want to be judgmental, and I think deliberation, obviously my model censors deliberation because that's what I focus on, right? But this is one way I've been trying to play about those distinctions in a sense of interactive communication but I think I love this kind of conversation of figuring out, okay, how are we using these terms? Which ones are we meaning? And what skills do students inherently have? Which ones do we need to develop them? So I've been playing with this is a little bit of a different way of thinking about that we can dive into later, or if people are interested, kind of email me, but certainly keeping on refining it.
Martine, I go one step further. And I re-put that whole circle of debate under deliberation. That if we have debate without it being in a deliberative context, then the deliberation is a place where we're testing the ideas. It's where we're collaboratively coming together to do that. When we take it out of that context, and we've done it as a discipline, it's us, right? Yeah. We took it out of a deliberative democracy context. That is when it becomes I think counterproductive, and thus the thing that I think has contributed to and mostly to our political divide.
Yeah.
It's so interesting. I was going to make a different suggestion and see if there's room in the Venn diagram for dialogue and debate to overlap. So lots of room for discussion. We could go on and
initially it did. It was a traditional Venn diagram, but then I was like, I didn't see as many connections between. So I actually purposely separated them, but certainly open to persuasion that they should be back together.
Awesome. Well, thank you for another great panel and discussion.